Hi, I'm Sid Brandy, co-founder and CEO at GitLab, and today we're going to discuss how we run board meetings. And I'm here with Stella, the Chief of Staff at GitLab, who's primarily responsible for organizing them together with our CFO, and Quinn, from CEO of Sourcegraph. Thanks for joining us. Quinn, you want to kick us off with a question?
Yeah, well, we looked at GitLab in a lot of ways, really love the handbook and the transparency. And I was asking Sid at dinner about a month ago how he runs board meetings. And of course, in keeping with GitLab's values, which we also share, he said, well, let's talk about this on a live stream so that everyone can benefit from these answers, because there's a lot of people all around the world that probably want to know how GitLab does board meetings. And we certainly do at Sourcegraph too. So my first question is just, what do you hope to get out of the board meetings? Because I think a lot of people view it as we need to communicate information to the board. But I know as a CEO, I'm like, well, what can I learn from the board? But there's a tension because you need to give people information to be able to give them the ability to learn from them. So how do you view that?
I'll go, or I see Stella unmuting. Stella, you want to go first?
I definitely want to hear Sid's perspective, but I think it's something we've been very intentional about, especially in recent meetings, because we used to say, here's a bunch of information. You're very smart. We want to hear your opinion. Please react to it and give us your feedback. And that wasn't targeted enough. So what we've been doing instead recently is we have 3 key discussion topics. And those are areas where we really try to focus the board. We give them the context we feel like we need for a proactive discussion. And we'll say, this is informing you, getting your feedback. Please let us know if this is off track. Or this is something where we think you have some background here and we really want you to pressure test. So it's being key on like what's most important to get the engagement and then being clear on the asks. But that's something we found very helpful recently.
Yeah, so board members want to help. First of all, in the board meeting, you should not be giving them information. Like that can happen asynchronously. So we send the board package 7 days beforehand. We send it with a memo from me, from the CEO. It kind of gives an overview for people that are like less slides, more kind of oriented towards text and prose. It also comes with videos about the relevant subjects. And the board deck is structured. The major parts are the key discussion topics. We have 2 or 3 every board meeting. That's where we spend all the time. And then there's a general session. You can ask anything. It's at the end. And then there's kind of updates by department. But that's like after the key discussion topics, because the board members want to contribute, but you should help them like find out where, because otherwise they'll pick some place themselves. And it might be an area where you really don't need any help. It might be an area where you're like, yeah, I know that number's kind of down, but we're fine there. We got to cover it. It will improve next quarter or something like that. You know this as a CEO in an e-group, you know the stuff that you're like, that number is okay, but I don't feel good about it. Or like that number's off and I really want your input. Or like, I see this coming down the road. How should we respond to that? So Stella helps me figure out those things. And then we've added a new thing before the board meeting. There's a small closed session, or small, it's short, relatively 25 minutes. And I take the board one more time through the key discussion topics and say, look, here's what I want you to pressure test. Kind of, this would be a good thing to focus on.
Interesting. So that's before the board meeting, because usually closed session is after.
Yeah, we changed that order. And then also kind of who to thank during the board meeting. These people, like really that incident, wow, people work their asses off. So you should probably do a thank you here and there. And on one hand, it's becoming more of a Broadway show that way, right? We're all kind of, we're instructed what roles to play and we play that role. It is the case that as a company grows, like that one board meeting, it cannot be the forum for everything anymore. This is more about kind of getting a coordinated view of what's happening in the company, what board members care about, what the CEO cares about, it's more important as the company grows that the board is aligned with kind of the CEO and that they're on the same page. A lot of it happens in one-to-ones. So before the board meeting, the board members that want to, and the majority of them, they get briefed by team members. I'm not even in those conversations. So it's direct interaction between certain people leading certain functions, the C-level execs at GitLab.
So is it like a CRO in the entire board? Is it certain board members that are specialized in sales or what?
Yeah, it's typically one board member and then one or two execs. Like if it's the CFO, will probably be one. If it's some of the others, like you have maybe have product and marketing or something like that. Also depends what the board members specialize in. We link board members to certain people. We have kind of specialities for board members. Marlene is really good in product, so Scott is a natural kind of fit to that. Then during the board meeting, sometimes things come up that you want to take. Wow, this is worth it. To dive in further, but it's probably going to be that board member plus these people, and they're going to dive into that subject after the board meeting. Then the board meeting itself, the general session, is about 90 minutes or something like that. And then we have closed sessions afterwards, right? You have a session with just the board members, and then a session where I drop and the board discusses my performance as a CEO, because the most important thing they do is let the CEO go if that's not going well.
And what was the evolution of that? I mean, GitLab, I'm sure you've learned a lot. And what did it look like when you were just getting started out? What did it look like when you had 200 employees? And do you think that this is the optimal for every company, or at what different stages would call for different things?
Yeah, I think as a company grows, your board grows. Like, for example, there's now kind of SEC required committees and things like that we need to have. So you need a bigger size. In the beginning, probably like 2 founders and a round A investor. So that's going to be less scripted. That's going to be less meetings up front. That's going to be fewer meetings afterward. And as your company grows, you add board members, and there's more prep and there's more work to follow up afterwards.
So the way that you've described it, 7 days before you send the board slides out, you've got all these meetings. I mean, there's a ton of coordination. How much are you directly, Sid, getting out of the board meeting versus how much are you getting because the organization has this, once every 3 months checkpoint, and you get, your executives to have that checkpoint? Does that make sense?
It does, and maybe Stella can add, but there should be no surprises during the board meeting. Like, if you have bad news, you should have give the board members a heads up, talked with them about it. It shouldn't happen during the board meeting. I think the best thing, totally no surprise. If they're surprised, sometimes it's like an insight that kind of develops from the group during the board meeting, but also that should be rarer and rarer as you kind of progress as a company.
I think something we've also been really proactive at is asking the board for feedback. We've iterated on our meetings. They used to have really long slide decks. They no longer do because we got that feedback. We used to be very big on like retrospectives, like here's everything that's happened and here's a problem and here's some thoughts. And I think the board around the time that COVID started, and there were lots of changes, really focused more on like, okay, well, what are you doing? Like, be more future focused. So we still do the past reporting. We shifted more toward that lens. So there's always a really good dialogue around like, we've done another iteration. This is what's happening. Is this meeting your needs? And as investors change and the mix changes, which happens as you mature as a company, I think folks look for different things. So we've kind of been on that journey with the investors and the board members, who aren't just investors anymore, which is also part of that journey.
Yeah. What are some of the big discussion topics that you brought up at past board meetings, and how did you know that that was the right topic? What came out of the discussion, and what were you looking for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Stella, I want to love your help here, but it's things like, hey, we have this big project going on to improve revenue. And that can be anything from a pricing or packaging change to kind of a new go-to-market motion or something like that. This is what we're planning to do. Here's 15 slides about the subject. We'd love to kind of hear from you and your expertise. It can be trying to reduce risk in usability, reliability, cybersecurity, financial reliability of financial statements.
It tends to be like less the operational things, the status quo things, more where something is off track and we want to point it out and be proactive and show our thinking around and get insight, or that we're doing something very different. So like, how are we thinking about 3 years from now? What is the potential acquisition strategy? What are we thinking as like pricing and packaging, as Sid mentioned? But I think it's the general session can cover all these things that are like day to day, and they always have the opportunity to have that data. We try to focus the discussion on things that are changing or different and warrant that additional thought and conversation.
When GitLab was 10 times smaller than it is now, I think I had the board meeting I was most worried about. We were about to miss the quarter by 30%. We ended up missing it by like 25%-ish. That's a big miss. And that means I'm in trouble. So I talked with my coach. I'm like, I'm so in trouble. We're going to have a big miss. And he said, look, they know it's a startup. Things will go up, things will go down. What they care about is that you understand exactly what's going on and that you know what to do about it. And that sounds trivial. I was just looking like a deer in the headlights just on that oncoming revenue miss and not thinking about those things. So for 2 weeks, every other day, I worked with my team to make sure I really understood everything, learned a lot about the sales function. And I figured out what we were going to do about it. So I opened a board meeting and just for half an hour, I walked them through everything. There's all the stuff wrong. There's all the stuff we're going to do about it. And when I was done, it was Bruce and Billy at the time. They just sat there. Billy said, hey, Sid, don't do any crazy things, because I was so intense about it. He was like, don't do any crazy deals, like give bad terms just to make your revenue numbers. And other than that, like they moved on. Like I understood what was happening. I was on it, and you could see I cared, and they were, that's all they want to see.
Yeah, that's good. How do you communicate the board topics either beforehand or after the fact to the entire GitLab team? And what do you think they're looking for from that?
It's one that I think we're struggling with and we need to figure out, is the honest answer. We used to share our board decks with everyone. That's something you can't do as openly as a public company. So the answer is I want to share board decks, but I can't yet. And I think that's something where we need to coordinate more with legal to see like what is that line. And as we become more mature as a public company, we'll probably better understand that and be able to release more. But the key things are decisions that have been made, when they could be communicated. But our general philosophy is share as much as you can, because we believe in transparency, and that context is important for team members. It's also empowering.
Yeah. So, if you're getting ready for an executive to have their first time working with a board member or presenting to the board, what do they need to do to get prepared and understand how to, operate and communicate with the board effectively?
Yeah, ideally, if someone's never done a board meeting before, you allow them to kind of be on one without like a heavy subject for them. Like those key discussion topics frequently have like an executive assigned to them. And what's important is to kind of have a feeling for like, when you get a question, should you give a bit more context or less? Should you kind of be to the point or not? You're dealing with kind of a couple of really intelligent people. In general, they can ask for more information if they want to, as long as they feel you're open to it. So you don't want to get one question and then give a 10-minute speech. Yeah, that's what comes to mind. Stella, anything you want to add?
I would just educate them on who the folks are, like what they care about, what their expectations are for just cadence and conversation. If there's any kind of opportunity to introduce ahead of time, if you feel like that's relevant, that's something that might make sense as well. A lot of times executives talk to the board as part of the hiring process or early on in it, but board members can be very, very different. So I think helping them understand the cast of characters, how things have run, what you've learned that's worked well and not well in the past would be helpful context.
Yeah. So I'm curious a little more on the logistics. We generally send the board packet out 2 days in advance, and it's not as good as some companies, better than others. But one thing is, we find things move so quickly that it's sometimes, hard after a quarter to get the board packet ready. So when do you do the board meetings? Is it after a quarter? Like, what's the timing? And then if you send the packet out 7 days in advance of the board meeting, what happens between 14 and 7 days or 21 and 7 days to get ready for that?
So it's not immediately after the end of the quarter. We had one a few days ago. Our quarter ended in October. So you can see like that's almost a month and a half gap.
So it's not necessarily tied to a quarter's results?
It's tied to a quarter's results, but it doesn't need to happen 3 days later.
Okay.
In our case, it's we end the quarter, then we first want to make sure we have all our data, then we report out to the street as a public company, and then the board meeting. And I think if you can't send the board deck out because you're still like stuff moves too fast, you might be too tactical in your board meetings, and you might need to go to a higher strategic level. We tend to have board meetings once a quarter, maybe a bit more frequent if you're a startup, but once a quarter. So there should be subjects that move over that timeline. If you have something else, maybe it's not a board meeting thing, but maybe it could be done with a separate meeting or email or something else.
I think that's where you just timestamp it and say like, these are my numbers as of this date, and then put like a block that says, note, this is what I see happening between now and our discussion. But people aren't going to hold you to that minutia with a few like swing point percents.
Yeah.
Especially as an early stage company. The other thing I note is that Sid does have touch points in between with the board. So in addition to these board meetings, we have informal board meetings, which is just Sid and the board once a month. Sid, you could talk more about those than me, but it is more of a kind of casual conversation and touch point, which probably takes less pressure off this main board meeting as well, because it's not like that's the only interaction.
Yeah, it's kind of like we do once a quarter, we do a formal board meeting, a dinner the night before, commonly, optionally in person. We do an informal board meeting where not everyone's required and it's more casual and there's less prep. There's kind of an update on like how are the sales going for the quarter and things like that. And
you're saying the dinner is kind of like an informal board meeting?
Sorry?
When you said informal board meeting, is that a separate event, or are you saying the dinner is kind of like
separate event? It's offset from the formal board meeting by kind of a month or something like that.
Got it.
And it has a kind of an update by the CLO and CFO. It has a kind of a sales update. The revenue numbers are always interesting to board members. So, but then the CLO, CFO drop in like the first 20 minutes or something, and then we have another hour or so.
Yeah. So, I'm interested, this idea of an informal board meeting in between is really interesting. How are the board members working with you and your team throughout? Like when that executive has a board member they're paired with, are they regularly in communication with that board member, like as a mentor?
Yeah, they can be. It differs a bit, but for sure, kind of the prep calls for the board meeting would be a logical place, and they can reach out in between. Also, the board members frequently like connect them with other like experts in the industry and things like that, depending on like how they want to develop their careers. And then I also have like a one-to-one with every board member during the quarter.
Cool. What do you think GitLab does differently because of the transparency value, or how can you take that a little further with board meetings? I imagine a lot of people would be very interested to see how this actually operates for the same reasons people love the handbook.
Yeah, I think it was pretty cool that when we were still a private company, we send the entire board deck frequently without any redaction to the whole team. I think we're going to bring part of that back. We're just going to do more redaction now that we're a public company. We also had a call with kind of the second group of leaders, so not the C-level, but kind of their reports to give context. I think transparency also means kind of being very real about what the state is. We're pretty critical of ourselves, so we're really upfront on what's not going well. Sometimes to the point where new board members are like, "Wow, is it that bad?" And it's like, no, it's not that bad. It's just that like we talk a lot about the stuff that we want to improve because it's more actionable. If it's going well, and then we don't think anything better is possible, then we can leave that.
Two things I'd add is the CEO shadows are part of the board meetings. So I think that's really cool. Sid has CEO shadows who are with him for 90% of his meetings, and they're part of those and attend it. And I think that's kind of an openness. Most folks at GitLab can be CEO shadows. There's that opportunity, even if it is for a 2-week stint. And I also, there's one of the key subject areas that we spoke about a few quarters back was transparency with the board and talking about as a public company, how do we do it a little bit differently and how can we lean into it more? We can't do it out for work. So I think part of it is just like that engagement in that space. And I think working with the board to understand what transparency looks like and what those lines are. And I think there's been like a really good engaged active dialogue you wouldn't usually have with the board. And that itself feels very different to me.
Yeah, that's cool. What other things do you think GitLab does well with board meetings that we didn't talk about?
I think like it's like investor updates, like they have to come out on a regular cadence. You don't move them around. And the second thing is like sending the information out ahead of time, like that's 7 days. I'm pretty proud that we tend to make that.
Cool. Yeah, well, this has been really interesting. Thank you for walking me through this. I learned a lot.